So I'm going to tell you a story. If it's not about what you know, and rather who you know, I want to share a story with you that I personally had. And this was around 1999-ish, more or less around there. And I was flying on this airplane in business class, of course. The ticket said economy, but in my head it was business class. And next to me was this Frenchman. But he spoke English, and he was involved in a very interesting industry. He was involved in this thing called the cell phone industry. In 1999, we had Vodacom, we had MTN. Cell C wasn't there yet. And we were sitting with around 5 million-ish odd connections, 4 or 5 million odd connections. And we had a conversation. He said, "What do I do?" I gave him a view on what I did. The conversation turned into something interesting because we found points of common interest. I thought that this would be a useful guy to get to know. He must have thought the same thing. And he opened my eyes to a new kind of business. It was called a WASP. And a WASP is a wireless application service provider. So you know those businesses that sell ringtones or do all the SMS connections? That's what a WASP is. So I asked more questions, and I listened very carefully. And I started to realize that this was a company for the future in South Africa. When I came back from Europe, I inquired and looked into what would be involved in starting this business. And I realized that all I needed was just one person who had some clever technical skills. So I put an idea to this individual. He liked the idea. I had no money, but equity is no different. And he came on board. 4 years later, that business was doing 15 million rand turnover a month. That's a big business. That's almost a 200 million rand business. 4 years later, we were sitting with around 22, 23 million cell phones in the country, from 5 when we started. None of this would have happened if it weren't for one single conversation that was purposeful and meaningful and created a relationship between me and an individual who I'd never met before. I only met him for half an hour once, and he opened my eyes to things that I never knew even existed. Networking, if it's done effectively, can be the single most powerful tool in your business. Guaranteed. I hope I've convinced you of it. So this chap, this is a guy I met in the United States of America. It's an old photograph. I met him in the United States of America. His name's Kevin Van Dam. And he looks happy, doesn't he? Okay. You see, what's making him happy is that over there. This thing called World Champion. What that is a bass. The bass got released, so don't worry about it. So Kevin Van Dam is an individual who earns around $12, $13 million a year. And all he does is fish. And the reason that he earns $12, $13, $14 million a year is because he has consistently been the world champion, and he makes his money with all these sponsorships that you see all over his shirt and hat. And Kevin told me a very interesting story, which I thought a lot about. I said to him, "So Kevin, talk to me about the profession of fishing." And he said to me, "You know, Pavlo, it's all about playing the percentages." Now, I had no idea what that meant. So I said, "Explain that to me." And he said, "I have the fastest boat out of everyone I know. I have the quietest boat out of everyone I know." He says, "When I go on that water, most of my competitors have 9 rods. And the rod and the type of rod you've got has an impact on what it does to the lure in the water." He says, "I take 16 rods. He said, "Look at this." And he showed me his boat. And when he opened up the floor of the boat, he brought out, it must have been about 8 or 9 tackle boxes. He says, on average, in any one event, I've got 3,000 lures that I take with me when I fish. He says, my competitors on average take around 600 lures. He showed me his fishing reels. I mean, honestly, his boat was like a shop. There were so many of them on there. And I said, what is this all about? He says, the way that a competition works is we all line up, they shoot a whistle or whatever the case might be, and we all dash off. And when I find a spot, nobody can be within 50 or 30 meters of my spot. Those are the rules of the competition. He says the fastest boat gets me to the best spot first. Once I'm there, these fish are very, very cautious. So the fact that I can move around with the quietest engine makes me invisible. And if on that day the sun does this, and the cloud does that, and the wind does this, and the water moves that way, I know exactly which rod, with which reel, with which color line, and with which lure I need to fish. And he says, if I don't have that exact combination, which prevents me from getting that fish, it could cost me $12 or $13 million a year. I play all the percentages of success in my favor. So, we've agreed networking is important, haven't we? We've understood the purpose of everything we're going to be doing. Whatever it was, it's now, hopefully, to build an asset of value. So the question is, how do we use networking in order to help us? Well, we're going to rely on Kevin Van Dam a little bit over here. And Kevin Van Dam said, you have a whole series of tools to help you win a competition. The rods, the lures, the line. Call it what you will. I'm arguing that in business, networking is one of those tools. So we're going to learn how best to use it. Because the more potent we can be with it, the better the result we will get. Perhaps you too might sit on a horrible aeroplane trip or go to some event by chance, and through a conversation that could take place, the two of you could connect very effectively with each other. Okay, the pitch, the dreaded pitch. You've heard about these things called the elevator pitch, right? The elevator pitch is where you step into a lift and suddenly next to you is someone who's important to you. And they're going up to the 3rd or 4th floor, and in that period that you're in the lift, you've got to convince them that you're a person worth meeting with. But in fact, a pitch has a number of elements to it. It's got the setup, which is really the icebreaker. It's got the lead-in, which is where you strike that match. It's got the follow-on, where you let the match catch a light. And hopefully, if you get it right, it's got the cementation at the end, which is where you engage and make it happen. So let's unpack the setup. This is often the most difficult part. It's the approach. Do you think it's a good idea to walk to someone who's at, let's say, the food station at an event, and as they've dipped their sausage in the tomato sauce and put it in their mouth, you say, hi. It's awkward, right? If you arrive at that event and you've got scrubby shoes, I don't know, a lot of people pay a lot of attention to shoes for some reason. I don't know, what does it say about you? And what happens if you decided to have a couple of beers with your mates before you arrived at the event? I don't know. That smells not so lekker, huh? So how do you actually do the setup? How do you do this approach?